By 8 o'clock that evening, Alice Aveling had been told she was not distinguished enough to dine with a duke, reminded that the roof above her might soon belong to someone else, and left with 2 half-packed trunks standing open in her bedchamber like patient witnesses to a future she had not yet chosen. Fellbrook House was small by Hampshire standards, a square red brick place with 3 good bedrooms, a narrow drawing room, and a view across the valley toward Vardon Hall, whose windows now blazed with enough candlelight to make the distant house look almost golden through the rain. Alice stood at her writing desk, with one hand resting on the unsigned renewal memorandum Lord Vardon's steward had delivered the previous week. The paper itself was harmless enough. The words upon it were not. Her favourable lease, first granted through the kindness of the late Countess of Vardon, would expire at Lady Day unless the Earl chose to renew it. Until then, Fellbrook remained her home only by courtesy, and Alice had learned long ago that courtesy was often the first luxury withdrawn when a woman ceased to be useful. Mrs. Beale entered carrying a tray with bread, cold chicken, and a little pot of preserved damsons. "You should eat something, Miss Alice." "I am eating." Alice looked at the untouched slice of bread beside her elbow. "I am contemplating it with great seriousness." Mrs. Beale gave her the expression she reserved for answers that were technically true, and therefore especially annoying. She was a broad, grey-haired woman who had once served Alice's mother, and had refused every suggestion that she might prefer a larger household after the Aveling fortunes diminished. Lady Miriam's footman was needlessly grand about the message. Lady Miriam's footman is needlessly grand about breathing. That earned the faintest twitch at the corner of Mrs. Beale's mouth. Alice folded the memorandum once along its existing crease and returned it to the desk. The message from Vardon Hall lay beside it. Lady Miriam Penhaligon regretted that the dinner planned for His Grace, the Duke of Norchester, had become more intimate than expected. Only titled neighbours and immediate family would be required. Alice, who had spent 3 afternoons helping Lady Miriam decide which flowers looked least desperate beneath ducal candlelight, was apparently no longer required at all. "You could have gone if you had wished," Mrs. Beale said, and stood behind Lady Miriam's chair in my brown silk while she introduced every baron's daughter in Hampshire. Alice picked up the bread at last. "No, I think disappointment should occasionally be spared the labour of dressing for dinner." Outside, rain struck the windows harder. The sound filled the room, then softened beneath the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Alice ate because Mrs. Beale would otherwise continue watching her. She had nearly finished when a sharp knock sounded from the front of the house. Both women looked toward the door. The knock came again. Not the loose rattle of a servant from Vardon Hall, not the impatient rap of the butcher's boy. 3 deliberate blows, followed by silence. Mrs. Beale set down the teapot. "At this hour?" Alice rose. "Stay behind me." "I was about to say the same to you." They crossed the small hall together. Alice took the lamp from the console and opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Wind pushed rain through the gap. A man stood on the step, soaked from his dark hair to the shoulders of his travelling coat. He was tall, broad without heaviness, and wet enough to look less dangerous than inconvenienced. Mud streaked one boot. His hat was in his hand. "Forgive me," he said. "My carriage has suffered a broken rear spring about half a mile down the road. My coachman is with the horses, and the footman has gone in search of a smith. I was told there was a house nearby." Alice studied him for one careful second longer. His accent was educated. His coat was excellent beneath the rain. Nothing about him suggested a vagrant. Those respectable men were not incapable of poor intentions merely because their tailoring was sound. "You are traveling alone?" "With 2 servants and 4 horses, none of whom appear inclined to carry me the remaining miles to Vardon Hall on their backs." Alice almost smiled. "That is selfish of them." His mouth moved first, not quite a grin. "I thought so." Mrs. Beale leaned nearer the opening. "Name, sir?" He looked past Alice, evidently relieved to discover another woman in the house. "Oliver Chalfont, ma'am. And you are expected at Vardon Hall?" Alice asked. "Very much so, I am afraid." Something in the answer suggested that being expected there was more burden than privilege. Alice released the chain. "Then you had better come inside, before Hampshire finishes drowning you." The warmth of the hall met him in a small cloud of steam from his wet coat. He stopped just over the threshold rather than striding deeper into the house. A courtesy Alice noticed immediately. "You are very kind. You may revise that opinion after supper." "Mrs. Beale has been threatening me with cold chicken for the last hour." "Only because Miss Alice refuses to admit cold chicken is still food," Mrs. Beale said. Oliver Chalfont looked from one woman to the other. "After half a mile in that rain, I am prepared to consider bread a feast and cold chicken a miracle." "You see," Mrs. Beale said, "a sensible gentleman." "Do not encourage him," Alice replied. "He has been here less than a minute." Mrs. Beale took charge of his coat, while Alice led him into the downstairs parlour where a modest coal fire burned. No room in Fellbrook was grand, but the furniture was well kept, the curtains clean and the brass fender polished. Alice had never been ashamed of the house. She objected only when other people expected her to be. Oliver stood near the hearth, holding his hands toward the warmth without crowding it. "Please sit," Alice said. "If your servants arrive, they will be brought here. I should not inconvenience you further. You are already dripping on the rug. The point of restraint has passed." He looked down. A dark pool had indeed gathered beside his boot. I have always suspected dignity was vulnerable to weather. Only badly constructed dignity. He laughed then, quietly and without performance, and something in Alice eased. Mrs. Beale returned with a dry towel and announced that she would warm the chicken. Oliver protested. Mrs. Beale ignored him with the confidence of a woman who had survived several generations of male protest. Alice crossed to the wooden settle beneath the window and lifted a folded length of faded green wool from its back. "Here." Oliver hesitated. "I cannot take your blanket as well. It is a travel rug, not the crown jewels. That distinction may become important if you continue offering possessions to strangers. I have not offered you the house. I am relieved. So am I." She held out one end of the rug. He reached for it at the same moment, and their fingers touched. The contact lasted barely a second, nothing more than cold skin brushing warm. Yet both of them stopped. His hand withdrew first. Not abruptly, carefully. Alice felt absurdly conscious of her own fingers after he had taken the wool from them. "Thank you," he said, and the humor in his face softened into something quieter. "Truly, you are welcome, Mr. Chalfont." He wrapped the faded green rug around his shoulders. Against the plain wool, his clothes looked finer, his posture more practiced, but the effect was oddly humanizing rather than grand. Alice sat opposite him while Mrs. Beale moved in and out of the room, preparing supper. He asked nothing about her income, her family, connections, or why the house contained half-packed trunks visible through the open passage toward the stairs. Instead, He told her the carriage had begun, listing badly before the spring finally gave way, and that his coachman had used language unsuitable for a man standing within hearing of 4 innocent horses. Alice found herself laughing again. It had been several weeks since laughter had arrived without first asking permission. When Mrs. Beale placed bread and chicken before him, Oliver looked at the simple plate as if it were genuinely welcome. He ate without affectation. Only later, when the fire had strengthened and the rain showed no sign of easing, did he glance toward the narrow passage and the corner of one open trunk above. "You are traveling?" he asked. Alice followed his gaze. "Perhaps." He waited. She appreciated that. "Fellbrook's lease may not be renewed. I am sorry." No instant questions, no false assurances, no promise that everything would certainly be well. Alice looked back at him. "It is a house, Mr. Chalfont, not a kingdom. People have been known to feel more loyalty to smaller things." The answer struck closer than she expected. She lowered her eyes to her cup. "Yes, they have." The clock passed 11 before Mrs. Beale declared the weather too poor for any sensible man to continue on foot. The downstairs parlour would serve as Oliver's room, Alice agreed, and Oliver accepted only after Mrs. Beale reminded him that refusing would mean making 2 women stand awake worrying whether he had fallen into a ditch. Alice left him with candles and the green rug still around his shoulders. Upstairs, she paused outside her bedchamber while Mrs. Beale checked the latch below. "He seems respectable," Mrs. Beale murmured when she joined her. "Respectable men also get wet. You know what I mean?" Alice glanced toward the open trunks. "I know that if Vardon will not renew Fellbrook, we shall simply find somewhere smaller." Neither woman noticed that the parlour door below had not fully closed. By the dying fire, Oliver Chalfont stood very still beneath the faded green wool, listening to the footsteps overhead and to the sentence of a woman who had given shelter freely while preparing, with equal dignity, to lose her own. Dawn came pale and cold over Fellbrook House, leaving the rain in silver beads along the window panes and turning the lane beyond the gate into a ribbon of dark mud. Alice had slept badly, though not because a strange gentleman occupied the downstairs parlour. She had heard no sound from him after midnight. It was the unsigned memorandum in her writing desk that had followed her into uneasy dreams, together with the image of Vardon Hall blazing across the valley, while she stood in a house she might soon be required to leave. By 7, she was dressed in a plain grey morning gown and fastening the cuffs when Mrs. Beale called from below. "Miss Alice, there's someone at the door." The urgency in her voice sent Alice downstairs at once. Oliver was already awake. He stood near the parlour hearth in yesterday's waistcoat and shirt. His travelling coat, dry enough to wear again, and resting over the back of a chair. The faded green rug had been folded neatly upon the settle. He looked rested, though the damp weather had left a slight disorder in his dark hair that made him appear less polished than he probably intended. A young man in Vardon livery stood just inside the front door, breathing hard from either haste or importance. His boots were splashed to the calf. "I was sent from Vardon Hall," he announced. His gaze moved from Alice to Oliver and paused. Something changed in his face. Not recognition, calculation. "They've been searching since first light. His Grace never arrived last night." Alice opened her mouth, but the groom looked toward Oliver again. "And you are, sir?" "A traveller whose carriage failed on the lower road," Oliver said. His tone was mild. The groom's eyes shifted to Alice. "Here all night?" Alice felt Mrs. Beale straighten beside her. "Mr. Chalfont was given shelter because the road was unsafe, and his carriage could not continue. I see. The groom's words suggested that he saw far more than had been said. Lady Miriam will want to know why an unmarried lady received a gentleman after dark. Alice felt heat rise beneath her collar, not from shame but anger. She had known this moment might come. What surprised her was how quickly simple hospitality had been rearranged into accusation. Lady Miriam may know that Mrs. Beale was present in this house throughout the night. Of course, miss, I only meant that people might misunderstand. Then perhaps people should be encouraged to understand before they are encouraged to speak. The groom flushed. Oliver had been silent until then. He stepped away from the hearth, and the room seemed to alter around him. Nothing in his clothes had changed. Nothing in his expression became threatening. Yet the easy humor of the previous night disappeared so completely that Alice understood, for the first time, that restraint could carry its own authority. "You will not place this upon Miss Aveling," he said. "I knocked at her door. I asked for shelter. Mrs. Beale remained in the house. If anyone at Vardon Hall requires an explanation, you may tell them the responsibility is mine." The groom looked uncertain. "Sir? I didn't mean to accuse anyone." "Then don't." The words were quiet. That made them more effective. Alice turned toward Oliver. He did not look at her, as though he had rescued her from something. He looked at the groom, holding the correction exactly where it belonged. "The distinction mattered. You may also tell Lady Miriam," Oliver continued, "that Miss Aveling behaved with more propriety than many households would have managed under the same circumstances. She gave assistance to a stranded traveller and nothing more." The groom swallowed. "Yes, sir." Hoofbeats sounded outside before anyone could speak again. They came rapidly along the wet lane, followed by the creak of wheels and the heavy jingle of harness. The Vardon groom glanced toward the door. Oliver's expression changed by a fraction. "That will be my carriage." Alice followed the others into the hall. Mrs. Beale opened the door, and cold morning air entered with the smell of rain-soaked earth. A dark travelling carriage had drawn up before Fellbrook. One rear corner sat newly braced, the damaged spring evidently repaired enough for the journey. Two liveried servants dismounted. Their coats were dark and severe, their buttons polished despite the mud. One of them hurried forward. The coachman climbed down more carefully, then removed his hat the moment he saw Oliver standing in Alice's doorway. "Your Grace," he said, bowing. The words entered the hall with extraordinary simplicity. Alice did not move. For one heartbeat, she thought she had misheard. The Vardon groom went white. Mrs. Beale made a small sound behind her. Oliver closed his eyes briefly, as if there were moments in life one could foresee and still fail to prevent. Then he turned toward Alice. She saw the answer before he spoke it. The traveller who had eaten cold chicken before her fire, who had worn her father's faded rug around his shoulders, who had joked about being carried by horses, was the man Vardon Hall had spent days preparing to impress, the Duke of Norchester. Alice became aware of every careless sentence she had spoken. The remark about the crown jewels, her criticism of Vardon Hall, the confession that she might lose Fellbrook. She felt foolish for exactly 1 second. Then something steadier replaced it. None of those words had been false. Oliver stepped back into the hall, away from the servants outside. "Miss Aveling, I owe you an apology." His voice had lost the command he had used with the groom. "Chalfont is my family name. I did not give you a false one." Alice looked at him. "No, but I allowed you to believe I was an ordinary gentleman." You were a wet gentleman with a broken carriage. That seemed sufficiently descriptive at the time. A faint, almost helpless smile touched his mouth, then disappeared. I should have told you. Would you have told the first house you reached? He hesitated, probably not before I knew whom I was speaking to. Then perhaps the offence is not quite as grave as you fear. Mrs. Beale, who had recovered enough to remember herself, dropped into a deep curtsy. Alice did the same, though more slowly. When she straightened, the distance between herself and Oliver felt suddenly measurable. Yesterday, he had been seated near her fire. This morning, he was his grace. Oliver noticed. She knew he noticed, because his gaze rested on her face a moment too long. You needn't become formal because of this, he said softly. I think I must become somewhat formal. Must you? You're a duke. Unfortunately, yes. The ruefulness in his answer nearly drew a smile from her. Nearly. And I am Miss Aveling of Fellbrook House, the woman who gave shelter to a stranger. That too. His expression changed. Whatever reply had first occurred to him, he set it aside. You said last night that you might have to leave this house. Alice glanced toward the writing desk in the other room, where the renewal memorandum remained untouched. He had heard her conversation with Mrs. Beale then. I did. I will not ask about it now. Relief came so unexpectedly that Alice almost showed it. A duke could have made the question feel like an order, even without meaning to. Oliver did not. Thank you. Outside, one of his servants shifted beside the carriage, clearly aware that Vardon Hall had been waiting for its missing guest since the previous evening. Oliver picked up his dry travelling coat. Mrs. Beale moved automatically to help, but he took it himself. His eyes fell briefly toward the folded green rug on the settle. He did not reach for it. It belonged here. Alice was glad he understood that without being told. At the threshold, he stopped. There is one thing I would like you to believe, Miss Aveling. She waited. Had I arrived here with my title written across my coat, your kindness would have mattered no more to me than it did when you thought I was nobody in particular. Alice held his gaze. Then you misunderstand me, Your Grace. The title sounded strange between them. I would have opened the door either way. For the first time since the revelation, Oliver looked genuinely unsettled, not offended. Moved, he bowed to her with a gravity he had not shown at Vardon groom or servant. Then I am more in your debt than I knew. Alice watched him cross the wet path and enter the waiting carriage. Only after the wheels turned toward Vardon Hall did Mrs. Beale exhale. A duke. Alice kept her eyes on the lane until the carriage vanished beyond the hedgerow. Yes, in my parlour, our parlour. Mrs. Beale looked at her. You gave the Duke of Norchester cold chicken. Alice finally smiled. He survived. Across the valley, Vardon Hall waited for its honoured guest. Alice did not yet know that before breakfast ended there, Oliver Chalfont would ask one question no one in that house had prepared to answer. Why, on the evening arranged entirely for his arrival, had Miss Alice Aveling been deliberately left out? By the time Oliver Chalfont reached Vardon Hall, the household had already transformed his absence into an event. Footmen moved with twice their usual precision. The butler met the carriage before the steps had been properly set, and somewhere beyond the entrance hall, a woman's voice broke off so abruptly that Oliver knew his arrival had been announced before anyone actually spoke his name. Vardon Hall was an impressive house, built to communicate permanence. Its stone facade rose above, clipped lawns still shining from the night's rain, and its central hall displayed enough portraits of Penhaligon ancestors to suggest that no family decision had ever been made without at least 6 dead relations watching. Oliver removed his gloves and handed them to a servant. Lady Miriam Penhaligon entered from the drawing-room almost at once. She wore pale blue, perfectly arranged for mourning, and gave him a smile polished enough to have survived rehearsal. "Your Grace, we were terribly concerned. I am sorry to have caused anxiety. We sent men along both roads. Father was ready to send again." Her gaze moved briefly to the mud still marking Oliver's boots. "You must have had an appalling night." "Not at all." That answer surprised her. "Your carriage was damaged." "The carriage was inconvenienced. I was very comfortably received." Lord Vardon appeared behind his daughter, a tall man whose grey hair and measured expression made every conversation feel faintly administrative. "Norchester, thank heaven. We had begun to fear something worse than a broken spring." They exchanged formal greetings. Oliver allowed himself to be guided into the breakfast room, where the untouched remains of the previous evening's elaborate dinner had been reduced to quiet evidence of wasted preparation. Silver gleamed. Flowers drooped slightly in their arrangements. Lady Miriam indicated a place near the fire. "You must tell us where you spent the night." Oliver accepted coffee, but not the chair. "At Fellbrook House." The name had an immediate effect. Miriam's hand paused over the sugar bowl. Vardon's expression did not change, but Oliver saw the glance father and daughter exchanged. "Fellbrook," Miriam repeated. "Miss Aveling's house?" "Yes. Alice received you." Miss Aveling and Mrs. Beale received a traveller whose carriage had failed in the rain. Miriam's smile returned, thinner than before. How extraordinary. It was kind, of course. She added sugar she did not appear to want. Alice can be very obliging. The faintness of the praise irritated him more than open criticism might have done. She was more than obliging. She prevented an unpleasant night on the roadside. Vardon cleared his throat. "A fortunate chance. Fellbrook is one of the smaller properties on the estate, conveniently placed as it happens." Oliver looked at him. "On your estate? Technically, yes. The late Countess took a liking to the Aveling family and arranged favourable terms. Miss Aveling remains there at present." At present. The phrase was mild. It was also deliberate. Oliver remembered Alice's voice above the parlour the night before. "If Vardon will not renew Fellbrook, we shall simply find somewhere smaller." He had the instinctive urge to ask what terms governed the lease, why renewal was uncertain, and what sum would make the question disappear. He stopped before any of those impulses reached his face. Alice had not asked him to know. She had certainly not asked him to interfere. "I see," he said. Miriam watched him closely. Alice has always preferred modest surroundings. Has she? She does not care for society in the way most women do. Oliver thought of Alice teasing him while rainwater pooled beneath his boots. He thought of her refusing to turn disappointment into tragedy. "That was not my impression." Miriam's eyes sharpened. "You know her very little, Your Grace. Then perhaps neither of us should define her too quickly." Silence followed. Vardon broke it by asking about the carriage. But Oliver had not forgotten the question that had travelled with him from Fellbrook. He waited until breakfast had progressed far enough that his words could not be mistaken for anger. "There is one thing I am curious about." Miriam looked up. "Of course. Miss Aveling told me she had been at Vardon Hall yesterday." "She was, and yet she did not dine here." Miriam glanced toward her father. The dinner became very small. Oliver looked around the breakfast room. 12 places remained evident in the spacing of chairs and silver. Did it? Colour touched Miriam's cheeks. only titled neighbours in the end. I was not aware I required protection from untitled ones. Vardon gave a diplomatic laugh. Miriam did not. Oliver let the subject rest. He had his answer. Alice had been excluded because someone had judged her socially inconvenient. The fact troubled him more than it should have, and he distrusted that trouble enough not to act on it yet. The following morning, a servant from Stonecross Park brought fresh clothes and correspondence. By 11, Oliver had sent his card to Fellbrook and waited in the carriage until Mrs. Beale returned word that Miss Aveling would receive him. He entered the same narrow hall where he had stood wet and unknown 2 mornings before. The green travel rug was no longer on the parlour settle. It had been folded elsewhere after drying, and the room looked exactly as it had before him, which produced an absurd disappointment he could not justify. Alice entered in a dark green morning gown with simple cuffs. Her curtsy was correct, too correct. "Your Grace, Miss Aveling." Mrs. Beale settled near the window with a basket of mending and the unmistakable air of a woman who intended to hear nothing while missing very little. Oliver sat only after Alice did. For a moment, neither spoke. "Your carriage appears to have forgiven Hampshire," Alice said, provisionally. "And the horses?" "Still refusing to carry me individually." Her mouth curved before she stopped herself. "I am pleased to hear standards remain." There it was, a glimpse of the woman who had spoken to him before a title stood between them. Oliver felt a surprising relief. "I came partly to tell you that I corrected the account at Vardon Hall." Her expression changed. "Corrected?" "Only the facts. That Mrs. Beale was present. That I asked for shelter. That nothing improper occurred." Alice glanced toward Mrs. Beale, who continued sewing. "Thank you. I said nothing more. Nothing more. Nothing about your lease. Nothing about why you were excluded from dinner. Nothing about what anyone ought to think of you. You did not ask me to." Alice studied him long enough that he became aware of how unusual it was for anyone to look at him without immediately preparing an answer designed to please. Most men in your position would have done what they considered helpful and informed me afterward. Most men in my position are probably unbearable. Oliver, that is unfair. The name escaped her naturally. Both of them went still. Alice's eyes widened by the smallest degree. "Your Grace." He looked down for a moment, because if he did not, his satisfaction would have been embarrassingly visible. "I preferred the first version." "I am sure you did. You needn't sound alarmed." "I am not alarmed. You are sitting very straight. That is how chairs work." He laughed. Mrs. Beale's needle paused, though she did not look up. Alice tried to remain severe and failed. The tension in the room loosened. "I am grateful you did not speak about Fellbrook," she said after a moment. "I intend to request the renewal myself. Then I will not interfere." She searched his face again. "Just like that? You sound disappointed, surprised. I can attempt something more ducal if you prefer. I could summon 3 solicitors and frighten an estate steward before luncheon." This time she laughed openly. "Please don't." "Then restraint it is." Their conversation moved to smaller things after that. The rain had damaged a fence near the lower meadow. Mrs. Beale had discovered that Oliver had left one handkerchief in the parlour and insisted it be returned. Alice told him, with suspicious innocence, that the cold chicken had not survived his departure. He answered that he would mourn privately. Nothing, they said, mattered greatly, and that was precisely why Oliver valued it. By the time he rose to leave, the formality between them had not vanished, but it no longer occupied the whole room. At the door, Alice curtsied again. This time there was humor in her eyes. "Good day, Your Grace." "Good day, Miss Aveling." He almost added that he hoped she would forget herself again. Not asking for familiarity would have made it another duty. Outside, his carriage waited beside the wet lane. Inside Fellbrook, Alice returned to the drawing room with more warmth in her face than she wished Mrs. Beale to notice. Neither of them knew that before the afternoon ended, Lady Miriam would begin receiving callers at Vardon Hall. She would not accuse Alice of anything. She would not need to. With a small smile and the appearance of reluctant discretion, she would repeat only one sentence. His Grace spent the night at Fellbrook. By the fourth morning after the storm, Alice discovered that a reputation could be altered without anyone speaking a direct falsehood. No scandal sheet arrived. No accusation was delivered to her door. Nothing so crude would have suited Lady Miriam. Instead, Mrs. Beale returned from the village with 2 loaves, a packet of tea, and the uncomfortable expression of someone carrying news she would rather have left in the baker's shop. Alice was seated at the drawing-room table with the Fellbrook renewal memorandum before her, reading the same 3 lines for perhaps the 6th time. The paper had not changed. The late Countess's favourable arrangement would expire at Lady Day. Continued occupation depended upon Lord Vardon's approval. Alice looked up. What happened? Mrs. Beale removed her gloves slowly. Mrs. Cattermole asked whether His Grace truly slept here. Alice lowered her eyes to the memorandum. He did. That was not what she meant. No. Mrs. Beale came farther into the room. I told her I was in the house the entire night. Alice folded the paper along its existing crease, careful not to sharpen it unnecessarily. Did that satisfy her? She said she was sure everything was perfectly respectable. Alice almost smiled. In Hampshire, perfectly respectable could carry the same weight as deeply suspicious if spoken with the proper pause. Then, we are fortunate to have been acquitted by the bakery. Mrs. Beale did not smile. Lady Miriam has been telling people His Grace spent the night at Fellbrook. That is true. She is not telling them I was here. Alice looked toward the window. Beyond the bare hedges, the distant roofline of Vardon Hall showed grey beneath a clear autumn sky. There it was. Not invention, omission. A story with one person carefully removed from it until kindness looked like calculation. She will not accuse me openly, Alice said. She doesn't need to. Mrs. Beale's mouth tightened. If anyone asks me directly, I'll tell them. Yes. Alice placed the memorandum back inside her writing desk. But do not chase after the rumor. We will not run through the county announcing that nothing happened. You sound very calm. I am practicing. The first consequence arrived before noon. A groom from Kingswell Lodge delivered a note from Mrs. Harbury, a widow of long acquaintance, who had invited Alice to a small musicale the following week. The note was cordial. The musicale, regrettably, had become more intimate, family only. Alice read it twice, then passed it to Mrs. Beale. Another intimate gathering, Mrs. Beale said. Hampshire is becoming remarkably private. Alice took the note back and set it beside the fire without burning it. It was not evidence of anything except cowardice, and cowardice rarely improved through preservation. Still, the withdrawal hurt more than she expected. Mrs. Harbury had taken tea at Fellbrook only a month earlier, and had accepted Alice's help arranging a collection for a tenant widow. One night of shelter had outweighed years of ordinary conduct, because the man beneath her roof had turned out to possess a dukedom. Alice stood and crossed to the mantel. She refused to let Mrs. Beale see her hands tighten. I think I shall write to Lord Vardon about the lease tomorrow. Mrs. Beale stared at her. Now, especially now, you could ask His Grace to speak for you. Alice turned. No. The answer came too quickly to be mistaken. She softened it. Fellbrook is my concern. If Lord Vardon renews the lease, I want it because he considers me a suitable tenant, not because a duke reminded him I exist. Mrs. Beale sighed. You are a difficult woman. That is fortunate. Easy women are so often managed. Oliver arrived that afternoon during proper calling hours. His card preceded him by several minutes, and Mrs. Beale received him with the same stiff dignity she had shown since learning that the man who had slept in her parlour outranked almost every nobleman in the county. Alice met him in the drawing-room. He saw the note from Kingswell Lodge, where it lay near her work-basket. His attention rested on it for only a moment. Something has happened. Alice sat. That is a very ducal way to begin a social call. I can start again. He took the chair opposite hers. Good afternoon, Miss Aveling. Your curtains remain admirable. Has something happened? She should not have smiled, but she did. Mrs. Harbury has discovered an urgent preference for family intimacy. Because of me. Because people enjoy half a story more than a whole one. His expression sharpened. Miriam. Alice did not answer. She did not need to. Oliver leaned back, the humour leaving his face. I heard something similar at Vardon Hall this morning. She said your hospitality had been unusually fortunate. How delicately poisonous. I can stop it. Alice looked at him. How? By making it very clear that Mrs. Beale was present, that I arrived uninvited, and that any suggestion against you is an insult to me as much as to you. And then people will think twice about insulting a duke. He paused. Yes, not about misjudging me. The distinction landed. Oliver looked away toward the hearth. No. Alice folded her hands in her lap. I am grateful you wish to defend me, truly. But if you stand in every drawing-room in Hampshire and announce that Alice Aveling is respectable, because the Duke of Norchester says so, what happens when you leave? I do not intend to leave immediately. The answer was quiet enough that she noticed it. That is not the point. I know. He rose, then seemed to remember that movement from a duke could feel like command in a small room. He stopped beside his chair instead of pacing. My instinct is to remove the difficulty. I had noticed. It is not always a virtue. Alice studied him. The admission sounded more personal than the conversation required. No, she said, it is not. Oliver looked toward Mrs. Beale, who sat near the far window with her sewing, then back to Alice, his voice lowered without becoming secretive. My elder brother was meant to be Norchester. Alice had not known he had a brother. She said nothing. He was prepared for it from childhood. I was prepared to be useful elsewhere. Then he died, and suddenly every room became different. There was no theatrical grief in his expression. That made the loss feel older and more deeply settled. People watched what I said, whom I spoke to, where I stood. A dinner invitation became speculation. A kindness became preference. A preference became intention. I learned very quickly that anyone near me could be drawn into meanings they had never chosen. Alice understood before he finished. So you withdrew? Yes. He gave a small, humourless smile. It seemed responsible. And was it Oliver met her eyes sometimes? That is not an answer. No, his gaze remained on hers. The truthful answer is that I stopped asking whether people wanted me to stay. I decided absence was safer for them and called that consideration. The room seemed quieter. Alice had expected irritation, perhaps authority. She had not expected this. You speak of it as though you already know it was a mistake. I know it became a habit. Habits can be mistakes with good tailoring. For 1 second he stared at her, then a genuine laugh escaped him. There you are. Where? The woman who informed me that dignity is vulnerable to weather. Alice felt warmth rise to her face and disliked herself for it. She has not gone anywhere. Good. His answer came without wit. That made it more intimate than anything else he had said. Neither of them moved. There was no touch, and Alice was grateful for the absence of one. The distance between their chairs felt alive enough already. Oliver broke the silence first. What do you want me to do about Miriam? Alice answered carefully. Do not make a proclamation. If someone asks you directly, tell the truth. Otherwise, allow me to live long enough for people to become bored. You have considerable faith in boredom, more than I have in society. And Fellbrook, his eyes flicked once toward the writing desk. Alice remembered that he had heard enough on his first night to know the lease was uncertain. I will write to Lord Vardon myself. Do you want my help? No. Oliver nodded once. No argument, no wounded pride. Then I will not interfere. Something eased inside her that had nothing to do with the rumor. Thank you. He stood to leave a few minutes later. At the door, Alice gave him the proper curtsy. Good afternoon, Your Grace. He hesitated. Good afternoon, Miss Aveling. He did not ask her to call him Oliver again. He did not promise to fix what had happened. Yet after he left, Alice remained in the hall longer than necessary, thinking of a man who had inherited one of England's greatest titles and responded by making himself smaller so other people might remain untouched. Upstairs, the trunks still waited. In the drawing room, the Fellbrook memorandum remained in Alice's desk, still hers to act upon. Before dusk, she took it out again, placed a clean sheet of paper beside it, and began a formal request for renewal in her own name. The Fellbrook renewal memorandum left Alice's possession on a clear Tuesday morning, carried across the valley in the leather dispatch case of Lord Vardon's estate clerk. And, for the first time since it had arrived at her house, she found herself wishing she had made a copy. She had not. The original sheet was the document requiring the Earl's approval, and Alice had no intention of behaving like a woman who expected dishonesty before any had occurred. She enclosed it with the formal request she had drafted the previous evening, stating plainly that she wished to renew the lease upon the favorable terms established by the late Countess of Vardon. There was no mention of Oliver. There was no appeal to friendship, gratitude, or rank. At 9:30, she watched the clerk place both papers inside his case and buckle the strap. His lordship will consider it, she asked. I expect so, miss. The man's careful expression revealed nothing. There are several estate matters awaiting his attention. Of course. Alice thanked him and closed the door after he departed. Mrs. Beale appeared from the passage. I dislike the way he said several. You dislike most adverbs when spoken by estate clerks. With reason. Alice turned toward the drawing room. Her writing desk looked strangely empty without the memorandum resting inside it. It is done now, and if Lord Vardon delays, then he delays, and if he refuses. Alice paused. Then we shall know where we stand. Mrs. Beale muttered something about men who owned too much land, but Alice did not ask her to repeat it. By noon, the absence of an answer had become less troubling than an encounter in the village. Alice had gone to collect thread and sealing wax, a journey so ordinary she had almost welcomed it. Near the churchyard gate, she saw Mrs. Harbury approaching with her married niece. Only a month before, Mrs. Harbury would have stopped, taken Alice's hands, and complained for 15 minutes about the unreliability of musicians. Now her gaze touched Alice's face and slid away. The niece looked embarrassed. Mrs. Harbury adjusted the ribbon of her bonnet and found sudden interest in a memorial stone across the lane. Alice walked past without slowing. She did not turn. The hurt came afterward, quietly, while she stood in the stationer's shop, selecting sealing wax she did not particularly need. There was no accusation to answer. That was what made it so effective. One could defend oneself against words. Silence left nothing to seize except one's own dignity. When she returned to Fellbrook, Mrs. Beale took one look at her face and asked no question. Alice was grateful for that too. A reply from Vardon Hall arrived shortly after 2. It was not from Lord Vardon. His steward wrote that the Earl had received Miss Aveling's request and would consider the matter when the present demands upon the estate permitted. No date was offered. No objection was stated. The original memorandum was not returned. Alice read the short note once and set it beside her teacup. "There," she said, "we have progressed from uncertainty to formally acknowledged uncertainty." Mrs. Beale frowned at the paper. "He means to make you wait." "Perhaps. You know he does." Alice lifted her tea. Knowing what a man intends before he has done it is a dangerous luxury. So is pretending not to know. Alice looked at her. Mrs. Beale resumed arranging the fire with unnecessary force. Before Alice could answer, the sound of carriage wheels came along the lane. She recognized neither the rhythm nor the horses, but Mrs. Beale did. His Grace. Alice's hand tightened around the teacup. The reaction irritated her because it had nothing to do with fear. She set the cup down carefully. Oliver's card arrived at the door before he did, as propriety required. Mrs. Beale accepted it, made him wait the appropriate interval, then returned with an expression of exaggerated innocence. "Will you receive him?" "You already know I will. I prefer hearing you admit things. That is an alarming habit in a housekeeper." Oliver entered a few minutes later, dressed in dark blue, his boots dry this time, and his expression composed. The memory of him, wrapped in her father's green travel rug, seemed almost impossible beside the polished gentleman who bowed before her. Yet the moment his eyes met hers, some of the formality softened. "Miss Aveling, Your Grace." He glanced toward Mrs. Beale, who had resumed her place near the window with a basket of linen. "I see I remain under excellent supervision. Mrs. Beale distrusts dukes only slightly less than Weather. Weather has done less talking." Mrs. Beale sniffed without looking up. Alice gestured toward the chair opposite her. Oliver sat. His gaze moved once toward the writing desk, then to the steward's note beside her cup. "The lease, a response to my request. Good news? News would be overstating it." She passed him nothing. He did not ask to see the letter. "Lord Vardon has received my request and will consider it when estate business allows." Oliver's mouth tightened. That could mean tomorrow or February. Lady Day is not until March. You make uncertainty sound almost leisurely. I have had practice. He watched her. Something else happened. Alice nearly laughed. "Again? You are very calm. You have seen me calm before." "Not like this." She looked down at her hands. "Mrs. Harbury saw me in the village." And she discovered a remarkable fascination with gravestones. Understanding sharpened his face. "She refused to acknowledge you. She avoided an awkward conversation. That is a charitable description." "I am trying to improve myself." Oliver leaned forward, then stopped before the movement could feel like pressure. "Do you want me to speak to her?" "No." "To Vardon?" "No." "To Miriam?" "Especially no." The answers came with enough speed to make him exhale through his nose. "You have prepared for this conversation." I did not know we were having it. You seem remarkably efficient for an unprepared woman. You seem remarkably persistent for a man who promised restraint." That struck him. Alice saw the instant recognition in his eyes. He sat back. "You are right." The easy admission disarmed her more effectively than argument would have. "I did not mean to sound ungrateful. You do not owe me gratitude for an offer you declined." Silence settled between them. Mrs. Beale's needle moved quietly near the window. Outside, wind stirred the bare branches against the pale sky. Oliver looked at Alice with the same unsettling attention he had given her when she spoke of his habit of disappearing. "May I ask one question?" "You may ask. When you say no to my help, is it because you do not trust me to give it properly, or because accepting anything from me would make the gossip worse?" Alice considered the honesty of the question before answering. "Both, perhaps, and neither entirely." "That is wonderfully obscure. You asked a difficult question." "I did. I do trust your intention." She chose the next words carefully. "I am not yet certain what your intention becomes once it passes through the habits of a duke." Something almost like embarrassment crossed his face. "That is fair. I do not want Fellbrook because you frightened Lord Vardon into signing a paper. I do not want Mrs. Harbury to greet me because she fears offending you. And I do not want Lady Miriam silenced so thoroughly that everyone assumes she was correct and merely overruled. You want them to decide you were worth respecting before I entered the matter. I want them to remember I existed before you entered it." Oliver became very still. The words had struck somewhere deeper than she intended. "I remember," he said. The simplicity of it made her breath catch. She looked away first. "You knew me for one evening before learning anything worth remembering." "I learned quite a lot, such as, you are unreasonably defensive about cold chicken." A reluctant smile escaped her. "Anything else? You open doors in storms." The humor left his voice. "You refuse to apologize for having less than other people. You say difficult things without raising your voice. And when you are hurt, you become more polite, which is frankly terrifying." Alice stared at him. That last observation was unnecessary. It was the most accurate. She should have answered lightly. Instead, the strain of the day reached her all at once. Mrs. Harbury's turned face, the absent memorandum, the steward's empty delay, the constant expectation that she remain composed so no one could accuse her of deserving what was being done. Oliver saw something change. He did not move closer immediately. "Alice." Her given name in his voice was quiet enough that she did not correct him. He lowered one hand to the small table between them, palm open but not reaching. "May I?" She looked at his hand, then at his face. He was not offering rescue. He was asking for one small permission. Alice turned her own hand palm up upon the table. Oliver covered it with his. His fingers were warm. The contact was deliberate and still, nothing like the accidental brush over the green rug. He did not squeeze. He did not draw her nearer. He simply held her hand long enough for the room to become quieter around it. Alice let herself receive the comfort. That choice mattered. After several breaths, he released her before she had to ask. "Thank you," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "For trusting me with exactly that much." Alice looked at her hand after his had gone. "Do not become pleased with yourself. I would never dare. That is demonstrably untrue." He smiled. When Oliver left Fellbrook 1/2 an hour later, the lease remained unresolved. The gossip remained alive, and the original memorandum remained in Lord Vardon's estate office. Nothing practical had been solved. Yet Alice stood at the window, watching the ducal carriage disappear between the hedges, and understood that something had changed. For once, Oliver had possessed the power to act, and had chosen instead to ask. That evening, another envelope arrived from Vardon Hall. It contained no answer about Fellbrook. It contained an invitation to the Penhaligon Hunt breakfast. Alice read Lady Miriam's invitation 3 times before deciding that refusing it would give the county exactly the story it wanted. The card lay on the drawing-room table beneath the afternoon light, elegant, cream-colored, and so conventionally polite that no stranger could have guessed. It came from a household where her name had recently become useful conversation. The Penhaligon Hunt breakfast would begin at 10 the following morning. Neighbouring families, local gentry, and several titled guests were expected before the riders departed. Alice had no intention of riding. She had even less intention of disappearing. "You could decline," Mrs. Beale said. She was standing near the hearth, folding a length of linen with more force than linen required. "Of course I could. And you could stay here while they talk themselves tired." They would not grow tired. They would grow certain. Alice placed the invitation down. A woman who hides after being discussed is assumed to have something to hide. A woman who attends may be discussed to her face. At least then I shall hear the interesting parts. Mrs. Beale frowned. "You make unpleasant things sound like entertainment. It saves coal." That earned no smile. Alice softened. "The rector's wife offered me a place in her carriage. I shall arrive with her and return with her. No one can pretend I wandered into Vardon Hall in pursuit of anybody." Mrs. Beale glanced toward the window, as if the hall itself might be listening from across the valley. "Lady Miriam invited you for a reason." "Yes. Do you know what it is?" "Not yet." Alice's eyes moved briefly to the writing desk. The original Fellbrook renewal memorandum was still at the Vardon estate office. Lord Vardon had not returned it, signed or otherwise. That uncertainty had become part of the furniture of her mind. She could work around it. She refused to let it determine where she stood tomorrow. "Then, I think you should be careful," Mrs. Beale said. "I intend to be." That is what careful people always say before doing something stubborn. "I learned from you." Mrs. Beale made an offended noise and carried the folded linen away. By evening, the weather had turned colder. No rain fell, but the wind moved sharply through the bare branches behind Fellbrook and found every imperfect seam around the windows. Alice was seated near the fire when Oliver's card arrived. She knew the handwriting on the small accompanying line before Mrs. Beale finished announcing him. His Grace requested the favour of a brief call if Miss Aveling was receiving. Alice felt the now familiar tightening beneath her ribs and disliked the fact that it had become familiar. "He may come in." Mrs. Beale looked at her. "You answered too quickly. Then make him wait 30 seconds and restore propriety." "I was going to." Oliver entered after considerably more than 30 seconds, properly dressed for an evening call before dinner at Vardon Hall. His coat was black, his waistcoat dark, his manner composed, yet Alice had learned enough to recognize the difference between his public composure and actual ease. Tonight, he was not entirely at ease. "Miss Aveling, Your Grace, Mrs." Beale settled into her usual chair near the window, where she began mending a cuff. Oliver glanced toward the fire and stopped. The faded green wool travel rug lay folded over the back of the settle. Mrs. Beale had returned it there after airing it thoroughly, and Alice had scarcely noticed until she saw Oliver looking at it. "It survived me," he said. Alice followed his gaze. "Barely. I was a demanding guest. You ate cold chicken and slept downstairs. History has known worse tyrants. He smiled, but his attention lingered on the rug. I remember thinking it was too good to give to a stranger. You thought everything was too good to give to a stranger. I was wet enough to become philosophical. Alice leaned back slightly. My father used that rug whenever he travelled in winter. Oliver looked at her, the humour fading. She had not told him that before. I am sorry, I did not know. There is nothing to be sorry for. It was made to keep someone warm. She looked toward the faded wool. Warmth is no use, folded away. The words came simply. Their effect on Oliver was not simple at all. His expression changed with the stillness she had begun to associate with truths he did not know how to evade. That sounds like something your father taught you. No. Alice smiled faintly. My father would have wrapped himself in it and complained if anyone else touched it. I learned the principle, despite him. Oliver laughed, but only briefly. Then he sat in the chair opposite her. I have been thinking about what you said the other day. That is always dangerous. You said you were not certain what my intentions became once they passed through the habits of a duke. Alice remembered. I did. I think I know one answer now. She waited. They become decisions. His hands rested loosely on his knees, very efficient ones, often made before anyone else has been asked what they want. Alice regarded him carefully. You did ask before offering help with Fellbrook. Yes, and you listened when I refused. I am accepting praise for that only because improvement should be encouraged. How brave. He smiled again, but the smile did not hide what followed. Tomorrow may be difficult. Alice's fingers tightened once around the edge of her sleeve. You know about the breakfast. Miriam mentioned that you had accepted. Did she sound pleased? She sounded gracious. Much worse. Oliver's mouth almost curved. I agree. He looked at her fully. If she says something about that night, I will not answer for you. Alice felt the significance of the promise. Thank you. If she says something untrue about me, I reserve the right to object. That seems reasonable. If she insults Mrs. Beale, I may become impossible. From the window came Mrs. Beale's voice. I can manage Lady Miriam myself, Your Grace. Oliver inclined his head. I stand corrected. Alice laughed softly. The room settled again. Firelight touched the edge of the green rug and left the rest of the drawing room in quiet amber. Oliver's gaze moved toward it once more. You said warmth is wasted when folded away. I said it is no use. The distinction is devastating, naturally. He drew a breath. I think I have spent years folding away everything that might inconvenience someone. Alice said nothing. He did not look at Mrs. Beale now. He looked only at Alice. After my brother died, I convinced myself that closeness was a kind of danger. If people were associated with me, they were watched. If they were watched, they were judged. So I became careful, then distant, then very good at leaving before anyone could ask me to stay. There was no self-pity in his voice. That made the admission feel more vulnerable. Alice remembered his words from their earlier conversation. He had called withdrawal responsible. Tonight, he was examining the cost. Did anyone ever ask you to stay? She said. Perhaps. That is not the same as yes. No. Oliver looked toward the fire. I do not think I remained long enough to hear it. Alice's chest tightened. The strange thing was not that she felt sorry for him. She did not. Pity would have diminished what he had admitted. She understood him. That was more dangerous. And what will you do tomorrow? She asked. He looked back at her. What I promised. I will not answer for you, even if the room becomes uncomfortable, especially then. Silence followed. Oliver lifted one hand slightly from his knee, then stopped. "May I?" It was the same question he had asked before touching her hand the previous day. This time, he did not place his palm on the table. He merely offered it between them, open, waiting. Alice looked at him. The first time, she had permitted comfort. Tonight, she chose it. She moved her hand from her lap and placed it in his. Oliver's fingers closed gently around hers. He did not pull her closer. He did not speak. Alice could feel the steady warmth of his hand, the restrained strength in his fingers, and the deliberate absence of possession. She tightened her own fingers around his once. His eyes met hers. Neither looked away. The contact lasted far longer than the brief touch of the day before. Long enough for the silence to become its own conversation. Long enough for Alice to understand that she was no longer merely tolerating the attention of a powerful man. She wanted this man to remain. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it made her calmer. Oliver's thumb moved no more than a fraction against the side of her hand, almost a question rather than a caress. Alice did not withdraw. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I stay where you ask me to stand." "Tomorrow," she answered. "You remember that." "I will." They released each other slowly, almost at the same moment. No promise beyond tomorrow had been made. No declaration had been spoken. Yet after Oliver left for Vardon Hall and the sound of his carriage faded into the dark, Alice stood beside the settle and touched the folded green wool with one hand. Warmth was no use folded away. The sentence had seemed simple when she said it. By morning, she would discover how difficult it was to live by it when an entire room was watching. By 10:30, the following morning, Vardon Hall had become exactly what Alice had expected, and slightly worse. The hunt breakfast filled the long south room with bright coats, polished boots, riding habits, silver coffee urns, and the kind of cheerful conversation that sharpened whenever someone entered who had recently been discussed elsewhere. Alice arrived with Mrs. Fenley, the rector's wife, in a modest dark blue gown, suitable for a country morning, and without any intention of apologizing for being there. She felt the pause before she heard it. Not silence. Society was rarely so honest. Merely a thinning of conversation, as faces turned and then turned away again. Lady Miriam crossed the room to greet them. She wore green riding velvet, and the expression of a woman who had arranged every chair according to a private strategy. "Miss Aveling, how good of you to come. You invited me." Alice smiled pleasantly. "I dislike disappointing a hostess." Miriam's own smile held. "You have become much more difficult to disappoint lately, Mrs. Fenley's brows rose, but Alice only answered, "I find practice helps." Across the room, Oliver stood beside Lord Vardon and two neighbouring gentlemen. He saw Alice at once. She knew it by the slight change in his posture, not by any indiscreet movement toward her. He had promised not to answer for her. He was already keeping the promise by letting her enter without turning her arrival into a declaration. When their eyes met, Alice remembered his hand around hers the night before and the quiet sentence he had given her. "I stay where you ask me to stand." The memory steadied her. Oliver inclined his head. Alice returned the greeting, nothing more. For several minutes, the breakfast proceeded with determined normality. Coffee was poured. Men discussed the condition of the ground. One elderly baronet complained that the rain had ruined the north cover. Alice spoke with Mrs. Fenley and a widowed neighbour about parish repairs, until Lady Miriam drifted nearer with three women who had not previously shown interest in the church roof. "Miss Aveling," Miriam said lightly, Mrs. Dacre was just asking whether Fellbrook suffered badly in the storm. Alice looked at Mrs. Dacre, who appeared surprised to discover herself responsible for the question. One loose shutter. Nothing serious. How fortunate. Miriam lifted her cup, though I suppose the evening became rather more eventful than the house itself. A tiny stillness opened around them. Alice set down her spoon. The rain was certainly persistent, and such unexpected company. Miriam's voice remained warm enough that any objection might sound oversensitive. I confess, I should have been terrified to admit an unknown gentleman after dark. Alice could feel several listeners pretending not to listen. Mrs. Beale was with me, naturally. Miriam's smile did not move. Still, one hears such alarming stories about travellers. Mr. Chalfont was wet, not alarming. A few people smiled despite themselves. Miriam did not. Of course, you did not know who he was. No, what a remarkable coincidence. Alice held her gaze. Carriage springs are not usually known for social planning. That drew a soft laugh from somewhere behind Mrs. Dacre. Miriam's eyes chilled. Before she could reply, Lord Vardon approached. The Earl carried no cup now. His presence changed the exchange from feminine malice into something more dangerous, because he could give social judgment the appearance of authority. Miriam, he said mildly, we need not make sport of Miss Aveling's hospitality. I was doing nothing of the kind, Papa. I am sure. He turned to Alice. No one questions that Mrs. Beale was in the house. The phrasing made Alice instantly wary. I am pleased to hear it. But circumstances may acquire meanings that were not intended. That is unfortunately the nature of society. Meanings do not acquire themselves, my lord. Vardon's expression remained courteous. Quite so, yet His Grace's subsequent attention has made the original incident more noticeable than it might otherwise have been. The room had not gone silent, but the conversations nearest them had faded. Alice looked toward Oliver. He had moved closer, though he had not entered the circle. His face was controlled. Lord Vardon continued. Repeated calls from an unmarried gentleman are observed. Repeated calls from a duke are discussed. One cannot entirely blame people for drawing conclusions. About whose intentions? Alice asked. Vardon paused. Both, naturally. I have made no declaration of intention, no. But others may assume ambition where unusual opportunity presents itself. Mrs. Fenley inhaled sharply beside Alice. Miriam lowered her eyes as if embarrassed on Alice's behalf. That gesture, more than the accusation itself, nearly broke Alice's composure. Nearly. Then perhaps those others should ask me before assigning ambitions to me. Society is rarely so patient, Vardon said. Which is why prudence matters. Oliver stepped forward. Alice's heart gave one hard beat. She expected him to correct Vardon, perhaps to say exactly what he had promised the night before, that she would answer for herself. Instead, she saw something older rise behind his eyes. The instinct he had confessed to her. Scrutiny follows anyone near me. Distance keeps them safer. His jaw tightened. Vardon is right about one thing, Oliver said. Alice went still. He looked around at the watching faces. My calls have drawn attention to Miss Aveling that she did not seek. Miriam's expression sharpened with satisfaction. Alice waited for the rest. Oliver looked directly at her. For one terrible instant, she believed he would ask what she wanted. He did not. Fear had already made the decision for him. There will be no further calls, he said. The room became truly quiet now. I will not have Miss Aveling's name subjected to further speculation merely because I chose to visit Fellbrook. No shadow from my attention should fall upon her. The words were meant as protection. Alice knew that. Perhaps that was why they hurt so cleanly. The warmth of his hand from the night before seemed suddenly very far away. He had promised to remain where she asked him to stand. At the first public pressure, he had stepped out of her life without asking whether she wanted him gone. Miriam's face held the faint satisfaction of a woman who had just watched a door close. Someone near the windows looked at Alice with pity. That was almost worse. Alice lifted her chin. "Your Grace." Oliver's expression changed the moment he heard her voice. Alice. The use of her name in that room made several heads turn. She did not soften. "You have answered for yourself, Your Grace." Every word remained quiet. "You have not answered for me." A flush rose beneath his cheekbones. "I meant only to prevent." "I know what you meant." She spared him the humiliation of hearing the rest in public. "That does not make the choice mine." Lord Vardon shifted uncomfortably. Miriam looked as though she wanted to speak. Alice did not permit her the opportunity. She turned to Mrs. Fenley. "Would you mind terribly if we returned a little earlier than planned?" Mrs. Fenley's answer came without hesitation. "Not at all." Alice curtsied first to Lord Vardon, then to Miriam, and finally to Oliver. His face had lost all trace of ducal composure. He looked like the man by her fire again. Except this time, Alice could not offer him warmth, simply because he needed it. "Good morning, Your Grace. Miss Aveling." There was regret already in his voice. She left before it could become an apology he had not yet earned. Outside, the sharp air struck her cheeks as Mrs. Fenley's carriage was brought around. Alice climbed inside without looking back at the windows of Vardon Hall. Only when the carriage began moving did Mrs. Fenley speak. "He thought he was defending you." Alice watched the hedges pass. "Yes. Does that make it better?" "No." Her answer surprised them both with its steadiness. "It makes it sadder." At Vardon Hall, Oliver remained in the breakfast room while conversation slowly restarted around him. He could still feel the absence of Alice's hand in his from the night before. He had done exactly what he had once confessed he always did. He had decided that leaving was kindness, and had not waited long enough to discover whether she wanted him to stay. Before noon, Lord Vardon's estate office would send a messenger toward Fellbrook House, carrying the original renewal memorandum Alice had submitted. It was no longer unsigned in the same innocent way. Lord Vardon had written a condition upon it. The messenger from Vardon Hall arrived before Alice had removed the gloves she had worn home from the hunt breakfast. Mrs. Beale met him at the door, took the sealed packet, and carried it into the drawing-room with a face that told Alice she had already recognized the estate office hand. Alice stood near the window, still wearing the same dark blue gown in which she had left Vardon Hall with her dignity intact and something more private badly wounded. "From Lord Vardon?" she asked. "From the estate office." Mrs. Beale placed the packet on the table. "You needn't open it this minute." "That is exactly why I should." Alice broke the seal. Inside lay the same Fellbrook renewal memorandum she had sent days earlier. She knew the paper at once by the existing fold and the faint ink mark near the lower margin where her pen had touched before drying. It had returned to her possession. Lord Vardon had not signed the renewal in the ordinary place. Instead, beneath the original terms, he had added a paragraph in his own hand. Alice read it once, then again, more slowly. Mrs. Beale watched her face. "What has he done?" Alice handed her the sheet. The new condition was phrased with sufficient dignity to disguise its cruelty. Renewal might proceed upon Miss Aveling's written assurance that no improper expectation had arisen from the accidental hospitality extended to His Grace, the Duke of Norchester, and that no future private correspondence or conduct would encourage misunderstanding regarding that connection. At the bottom stood Vardon's initials. Nothing in the language accused Alice outright. That was precisely the point. He wants you to promise there's nothing between you, Mrs. Beale said. He wants me to promise there could never be anything between us. After His Grace just told the entire room he would stop calling. Alice's throat tightened. That makes it easier to demand. She carried the memorandum to the hearth, but did not put it near the flame. The paper was not an insult to destroy. It was an insult to understand. If I sign this, I keep Fellbrook. Mrs. Beale looked appalled. You cannot. I did not say I would. Good, but I understand why he chose the wording. Alice sat. Her hands were steady now. The steadiness felt colder than anger. He can say he is protecting the reputation of his estate. He can say he merely wants clarity. He can say a single woman who received a duke overnight ought to welcome the chance to remove suspicion. And if you refuse, then he will say, I refused a perfectly reasonable condition. Mrs. Beale lowered the memorandum. He means to make your home depend upon your silence. Not silence exactly. Alice looked toward the two half-packed trunks visible beyond the hall, meaning. That afternoon, Lord Vardon came himself. Alice had expected a steward. The Earl's personal arrival told her the matter was not merely administrative. He was received in the drawing-room with Mrs. Beale present, and he wasted little time after the formalities. I trust you received the memorandum. I did. Then you understand I am prepared to renew Fellbrook on generous terms. Alice placed the sheet on the table between them. Generous terms that require me to make a declaration about my private intentions. Vardon's expression remained composed. A declaration that would protect you. From whom? From speculation. Speculation encouraged in your own house this morning. His eyes cooled. Miss Aveling, you are an intelligent woman. You must see the difficulty. I see several. His Grace's attention has changed the situation. His Grace publicly ended his calls. The sentence cost her more to say than she let him hear. Vardon nodded. Exactly. That was prudent. If you confirm the matter is at an end, Fellbrook need not become part of an unnecessary scandal. Alice looked at him. And if I do not, then I may be obliged to reconsider whether the tenancy remains suitable. Suitable because of something I did. Suitable because of what people may reasonably infer. People infer what they are taught to. Infer, my lord. His jaw tightened. I came here to offer you security. No. You came to offer me security if I agree to your version of my life. For the first time, Vardon's polish slipped, only slightly. You are making this more dramatic than it is. Alice almost smiled. That is convenient. Lady Miriam may imply impropriety before a room full of guests, and you may attach conditions to my home. But if I object, I am dramatic. Vardon leaned back. Do you intend to continue receiving His Grace? The question landed where he meant it to. Alice thought of Oliver standing in Vardon Hall, saying there would be no further calls. She thought of his hand around hers the night before. Warm and careful. She thought of the fact that he had made a decision for her and called it protection. That is not your question to ask. It becomes my concern when the matter touches property on my estate. Fellbrook is leased to me. My conduct has not violated any term. Social respectability is not irrelevant. Then write that plainly. Vardon looked at her. I beg your pardon. Alice placed one finger beside his handwritten condition. Write that you believe I am unfit to remain at Fellbrook, because I sheltered a stranded traveller while Mrs. Beale was present. Write that you believe my reputation is damaged. Write that you will refuse renewal on that ground." Silence followed. Vardon did not reach for the pen lying near her desk. Alice had known he would not. "There is no need for inflammatory language," he said. "No, the softer language serves you better." Mrs. Beale's sewing had gone still near the window. Vardon rose. "I will leave the memorandum with you. Consider it carefully. Lady Day is still some months away. I would regret seeing you forced to make more difficult arrangements." Alice stood as well. "If I sign, you renew?" "Yes. If I do not, then I will have to explain." When asked why renewal proved impossible, the threat was almost graceful. Alice inclined her head. "Then I understand." After he left, she carried the original memorandum to her writing desk. She did not sign it. She did not tear it. She folded it along the same crease and placed it inside her writing case, where it would remain under her control. Mrs. Beale came to stand beside her. "What will we do?" Alice looked toward Fellbrook's narrow hall, the worn carpet, the familiar banister, the house that had held nearly every private grief of her adult life. "We will prepare to leave by Lady Day if necessary." Mrs. Beale stared at her. "You would give up Fellbrook rather than write one sentence." "It is not one sentence." Alice closed the writing case. "It is permission for him to decide what my kindness meant and what my future may mean." "And His Grace?" Alice's composure faltered at last, but only for a breath. "His Grace has already decided what is best for me once without asking." A knock came at the front door. Mrs. Beale frowned. Again, this visitor did not enter. A ducal footman delivered a small, folded note and departed. Alice recognized Oliver's hand immediately. She stood with it, unopened, for several seconds before breaking the seal. The message contained no flowers, no explanation, no request that she forgive him. Only one sentence asking whether she would permit him to call and apologize. Mrs. Beale watched her. "Will you answer?" Alice folded the note carefully. "Not today." She placed it beside the closed writing case containing Vardon's condition. One man had tried to control her future through property. Another had tried to protect her by removing himself from it. For the first time since the storm, Alice understood that both choices had required the same thing from her: silence. She had no intention of giving it to either of them. Alice waited 2 days before answering Oliver's note, not because she wished to punish him, and not because she had decided never to see him again. Punishment would have required a certainty she did not possess. What she needed was enough quiet to separate the pain of what he had done from the knowledge of why he had done it. By the second afternoon, the original Fellbrook renewal memorandum remained locked. Inside her writing case, Lord Vardon's conditions still unsigned, and Oliver's brief request for permission to apologize lay beside it. Alice finally wrote 4 words beneath his question: "You may call tomorrow." She sealed the reply before she could improve it into something less honest. He arrived the next morning during proper calling hours, with no flowers, no parcel, no solicitor, and no visible attempt to convert regret into generosity. That mattered before he said a word. Mrs. Beale admitted him, with the reserve of a woman who had not forgiven him merely because Alice might someday choose to. Oliver entered the drawing room and stopped several feet from Alice. He did not approach the chair nearest hers. He waited until she indicated one across the small table. "Thank you for receiving me. You asked to apologize." "I did," he sat. Mrs. Beale took her usual place near the window, opened her sewing basket, and made no effort to disguise the fact that her silence was conditional. Oliver looked at Alice. There was none of the lightness he had once used to rescue difficult moments from seriousness. What I did at Vardon Hall was wrong. Alice kept her hands folded in her lap. Why? He did not answer quickly. She was glad. Because I decided what would protect you without asking what you wanted. I told myself I was removing the cause of the gossip. In truth, I removed myself and expected you to live with the consequence. The accuracy of it unsettled her more than a grander apology would have. You also made it sound as though your attention had been a mistake. His face tightened. Yes. Was it? No. The answer came immediately. Not once. Alice looked down at the edge of the table. Then why say something so final before everyone? Because I was afraid. She raised her eyes. Oliver did not look away. Not of scandal for myself. I have lived through worse gossip than a country breakfast can manufacture. I was afraid that every day I remained near you would make your life narrower. Every call seemed to cost you another invitation, another greeting, another assumption. When Vardon said, my attention had become the problem, I heard the oldest argument in my own head and mistook familiarity for truth. Alice remembered the confession he had made beside the folded green rug. He had spent years leaving before anyone could ask him to stay, and so you left first. Yes. Publicly, yes, without asking me. His voice lowered. Yes, she let the silence remain. Oliver did not rush to fill it. That was new, too. You said you wanted to apologize, Alice said. Is that all? No. His hands rested loosely on his knees. I want to know what repair would look like to you, not what I think it should look like. Alice studied him. And if I tell you there is none? A flicker of pain crossed his face, but he did not turn it into persuasion. Then I accept that. Her chest tightened. There was something almost cruel in how much easier it would have been if he had arrived arrogant. Anger was simpler when the other person refused to change. When caring for someone becomes difficult, she asked slowly, will you always decide the kindness is to leave? Oliver became very still. The question reached him more deeply than accusation could have done. I have, he said. That is not the same as will you. No. He drew one measured breath. I do not want to, but wanting to be different is not proof that I am. Alice's gaze softened despite herself. He continued. My brother's death taught me that everything around Norchester could become public. I decided distance was the cleanest form of responsibility. I never examined how convenient that belief was for me. If I left first, I did not have to remain and watch another person suffer because of my name. I could call the leaving noble and avoid asking whether it was also cowardice. Mrs. Beale's needle stopped for 1 second. Alice heard it, though she kept her attention on Oliver. You cannot promise no one near you will be judged, no. You cannot make society kind, no. You cannot prevent every difficulty, no. Alice leaned back slightly. Then what can you promise? His answer came quietly, that I will not make absence my first solution again, and that if I am frightened enough to believe leaving is necessary, I will ask before I decide. Something inside her shifted. Not healed, not forgiven completely, but shifted. She stood and crossed to the writing desk. Oliver rose automatically, then remained where he was. Alice unlocked the drawer, opened the writing case, and removed the original Fellbrook memorandum. The same crease ran through its centre. Lord Vardon's handwritten condition remained beneath the original terms, initialed at the bottom. Alice returned to the table and placed the sheet before Oliver. This arrived after the breakfast. He looked at the paper but did not touch it. May I read it? Yes. Only then did he take it. Alice watched his eyes move across the added condition. His expression changed before he reached Vardon's initials. The anger was immediate and controlled only by effort. He made renewal dependent upon this. Yes, upon your agreeing to disclaim any future correspondence with me, among other things. Oliver read the paragraph again, and if you refuse, he told me he would have to explain why renewal proved impossible. Oliver's jaw hardened. He set the memorandum down with extraordinary care. This is coercion dressed as propriety. That was my conclusion. He stood. For one moment, Alice saw exactly what he wanted to do. Summon Vardon, demand the lease, purchase Fellbrook, bring enough ducal weight into the matter that the Earl could never use the house against her again. Oliver even turned half toward the door. Then he stopped. His eyes closed briefly. When he faced her again, the anger remained. But the decision had changed. What do you want me to do? Alice felt the significance of the question more strongly than if he had offered her the estate itself. She retrieved the memorandum and folded it along the same existing crease. Lord Vardon expects me either to sign or to become frightened enough to leave quietly. Will you sign? No. Will you leave? At Lady Day, if I must. Not before. Oliver nodded. What do you want from me? Alice returned the memorandum to her writing case and locked it. Then she faced him. Stay. He did not move. Stay, she repeated. Not here every hour. Not at my side like a guard. Stay in the matter. If Lord Vardon says something publicly, do not rescue me from the room. Do not send me away. Do not announce a solution before I have spoken. Oliver's face changed. What should I do? Let me answer first, and afterward. If he lies about something you personally know, tell the truth, nothing more. I can do that. Can you? Yes. There was no charm in the answer, no dramatic vow, and if every instinct I have tells me to step in sooner, I will remember that you asked me to stay, not to take over. Alice believed him enough to feel afraid of believing him. That was different from distrust. Neither of them crossed the space between them. No hand was offered. No touch followed the apology. Alice understood that restraint was part of the repair. Mrs. Beale rose only when a knock sounded at the outer door. She returned, moments later carrying a folded note from Mrs. Fenley. Alice opened it while Oliver remained standing. Her eyes moved over the few lines. What is it? He asked. She looked up. Lord Vardon has spoken to the rector. Oliver's expression sharpened. About Fellbrook. He intends to address the tenancy after Sunday service, publicly enough that no one will misunderstand why he refuses renewal. Oliver's first instinct showed again in the set of his shoulders. This time he did not act on it. What do you want? Alice folded the note. Exactly what I told you. She looked at him steadily. Stay, and let me speak first. Saturday morning brought 3 separate suggestions that Alice might prefer not to attend church the following day, each phrased with enough concern to make the insult almost respectable. The first came from Mrs. Fenley in a note delivered before breakfast. The rector's wife did not advise Alice to hide exactly. She merely observed that Lord Vardon seemed determined to make the matter of Fellbrook public, and that Alice might wish to spare herself unnecessary distress. The second suggestion arrived through a neighboring lady who sent word that illness would provide an entirely understandable excuse. The third came from Mrs. Beale, who stood beside the breakfast table with both hands planted on the back of a chair, and said, I am not telling you to stay home. I am only asking whether you have considered how many people will be waiting to stare. Alice spread marmalade across a piece of toast with deliberate care. Nearly all of them, I imagine. That does not trouble you? Of course it troubles me. Mrs. Beale watched her. Alice set down the knife. But if I stay here tomorrow, Lord Vardon will speak anyway. Miriam will speak afterward. By Monday, everyone will know why Fellbrook is supposedly unsuitable except the woman who lives in it. You could let His Grace answer. No. The word came gently this time, but with no less certainty. He understands that now. Mrs. Beale moved around the table and sat opposite her. And if Lord Vardon lies, then I correct him. And if he humiliates you. Alice looked toward the drawing-room door, beyond which her writing case remained locked inside the desk. The original renewal memorandum had not moved since she showed it to Oliver the previous day. Then he does it where I can answer, instead of where my silence can be translated for me. Mrs. Beale sighed. You are determined. Yes, very well. Her voice sharpened. Then so am I. Alice looked at her. Mrs. Beale, I was in this house that night. I saw the gentleman arrive wet through. I saw where he slept. I saw you go upstairs and him remain below. If anyone asks what happened, I shall tell them. Alice felt a sudden pressure behind her ribs. Only what you remember. What else would I tell? Nothing rehearsed. Nothing because you think it will help me. Just the truth. Mrs. Beale gave her a look of offended dignity. Miss Alice, I have spent 26 years telling you truths you did not wish to hear. I hardly intend to become unreliable now. Alice laughed despite herself. Forgive me, I shall consider it. The exchange steadied her more than reassurance would have done. By late afternoon, the house had settled into that peculiar quiet which comes before a difficult day. Alice checked the memorandum once, then returned it to the writing case and locked the desk. She would take it with her in the morning. Until then, it remained where it belonged. Shortly before 5, Oliver's card arrived. He had not appeared without permission. He had not sent instructions through servants. His note asked whether Miss Aveling would receive him for a brief call before dinner. Alice said yes. When he entered the drawing-room, Mrs. Beale was already seated near the far window. Oliver bowed first to Alice, then to her. Mrs. Beale, Your Grace. Her tone suggested he remained on probation. He accepted that without comment. Alice indicated the chair opposite her. You said the call would be brief. I am learning not to overstay an invitation. A useful skill, painfully acquired. There was the faintest trace of his old humor, but he did not lean on it. His expression became serious almost at once. I wanted to tell you one thing before tomorrow, because I do not want you to hear it from someone else and think I concealed it. Alice waited. Vardon has tried twice to discuss Miriam as a prospective match. Alice felt the words land and refused to let them alter her posture. Twice, once before the hunt breakfast, once yesterday. And what did you say? That there is no understanding between Lady Miriam and me. There has never been one. I will not permit anyone to imply otherwise. Alice studied him. Did Lord Vardon understand you? He understood very well. Was he pleased? No. Then I expect tomorrow will be especially pleasant. Oliver's mouth tightened. Probably not. He did not tell her what refusal might cost him socially. He did not describe it as sacrifice. That too, she noticed. Why are you telling me? She asked. Because it concerns the shape of the story Vardon may try to tell. Not because I think rejecting Miriam earns me anything from you. Alice held his gaze. That answer mattered more than she wanted it to. Good, Oliver nodded. And tomorrow you speak first. Yes, I speak only to facts I personally know. Yes, Mrs. Beale speaks for herself. From the window, Mrs. Beale said, At last a duke who can learn. Oliver inclined his head, slowly. Alice almost smiled. And if Lord Vardon offers a solution before I have finished, I wait. If he insults me, a muscle shifted in Oliver's jaw, I wait. If Miriam implies I pursued you, I wait until you answer. And if you hate every second of it, he looked at her fully. Then I hate it quietly. Something in Alice eased. The words were almost absurd, but the restraint behind them was not. You remember quickly when the lesson hurts. I remember because you made the cost clear. She looked toward the hearth. The faded green travel rug had been folded neatly over the settle after airing. It was ordinary wool, old, useful, softened by years. Oliver followed her glance, but did not touch it. I used to think action was the only honest form of care, he said. Alice returned her attention to him. And now I think action can be cowardice if it saves me from standing still beside someone else's pain. His voice was quiet. You asked me to stay. I intend to do exactly that. Alice's throat tightened. You make it sound very difficult. For me, apparently it is. There was no self-pity in the admission, only truth. He rose, perhaps sensing that the conversation had reached the point where another sentence might become pressure. I should go. Alice stood as well. He remained several feet away. No hand was offered. No expectation moved between them. That absence of presumption was what finally undid the last of her guardedness. Oliver had apologized. Then he had changed his behavior when no one was applauding him for it. Alice crossed the space herself. Surprise flashed across his face when she stopped in front of him. For one heartbeat, neither moved. Then Alice put her arms around him. Oliver went completely still. He did not seize the invitation. He did not assume that because she had crossed the distance, every distance between them had vanished. His hands remained at his sides for the smallest, most important pause. Alice tightened her arms enough to make her choice unmistakable. Only then did he lift his hands and hold her. The embrace was restrained, almost careful. Yet the steadiness of it reached places words had not. Alice rested her cheek briefly against his shoulder. She felt him exhale, not relief at being forgiven. Relief at being allowed to remain. His hand settled lightly between her shoulder blades and stayed there without drawing her closer than she had chosen. Alice, he said. Her name was barely above a whisper. Do not say anything you will regret tomorrow. His arms loosened at once, though he did not fully release her until she stepped back. I was going to say thank you. She looked at him. That would have been acceptable. A faint smile touched his face. Then thank you. For what? For believing the change enough to test it. Alice shook her head. Tomorrow is the test. I know. He bowed before leaving. This time, when the front door closed behind him, Alice did not feel abandoned. She returned to the drawing room and stood beside Mrs. Beale, who had very pointedly examined the same length of thread for the entire embrace. You saw nothing, I suppose. Naturally, you are a terrible liar, only in domestic matters. Outside, the last light faded behind Vardon Hall. A little later, the parish bells began sounding the Saturday evening hour across the valley. Alice listened until the final note disappeared. Tomorrow, Lord Vardon intended to explain publicly why she should lose Fellbrook. Tomorrow, Oliver would stand beside her and do the hardest thing she had ever asked of him. He would wait. The bells had been silent for nearly an hour when Alice did something she had not planned to do. She sat at her writing desk, took a small sheet of paper, and wrote Oliver a second note. The first had invited him to apologize. This one invited him to return. Mrs. Beale stood near the hearth while Alice sanded the ink. You saw him this afternoon. I know. And tomorrow you shall see him at church. I know that too. Mrs. Beale folded her arms. Then why summon a duke through the dark, like the heroine of a very poor novel? Alice looked up. I am not summoning him through the dark. I am asking whether he might call before 8, while you are sitting 10 feet away judging both of us. Respectability preserved. Relentlessly, Mrs. Beale's sternness softened. Are you certain? Alice looked toward the green travel rug folded over the settle. She thought of Oliver, pausing before he returned her embrace that afternoon. She thought of the way he had accepted her boundaries without trying to convert them into punishment. Tomorrow might change her place in the county. It might cost her Fellbrook. She did not want whatever lay between them to remain hidden behind fear until after the public battle, as if love could only be spoken once safety had been secured. Yes, she said. I am. Oliver arrived 25 minutes later. He came without his carriage lamps, blazing at the door, having dismissed the vehicle to wait farther down the lane, so that the household was not made into a spectacle. A footman brought him to the entrance and remained outside. Mrs. Beale admitted Oliver herself, and gave him a look that suggested one improper breath would be recorded for future prosecution. Your Grace, Mrs. Beale, Miss Alice is in the drawing-room. Thank you. I shall be nearby. I had assumed nothing less. Alice heard the exchange and almost smiled. Then Oliver entered, and the smile vanished because the sight of him affected her too quickly. He had changed for dinner, but wore no formal coat of ceremony. Only dark evening clothes appropriate to a country household. He stopped inside the room. You sent for me. I asked whether you would call. I stand corrected. His voice was gentle, but his eyes searched hers. Has something happened? No. He seemed almost more concerned by that answer. Then why did you ask me back? Alice closed the book she had not been reading. Because this afternoon we spoke entirely about tomorrow. Oliver waited. He had learned that waiting was sometimes the most respectful answer he could give her. Mrs. Beale settled herself beyond the open doorway with sewing, near enough for propriety, and far enough to grant them the illusion of privacy. Alice rose. Tomorrow may be unpleasant. Yes, Lord Vardon may refuse Fellbrook before half the parish. Miriam may say whatever she thinks will rescue her pride. People who have known me for years may decide the version easiest to believe is the version that makes me foolish. Oliver's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Alice took one slow breath. I do not want everything between us to be postponed until those people have finished deciding what I am. Understanding moved across his face. Alice, you said yesterday that you had spent years leaving before anyone could ask you to stay. I did, and I asked you to stay. Yes, you have. Oliver's composure shifted. The words reached him with almost painful force. I nearly failed you before I understood what staying meant. You did fail me. He accepted it without flinching. Yes, and then you apologized without asking me to make you comfortable about it. You let me tell you what repair required. You have followed it. Alice looked down briefly, then back at him. That matters to me. Oliver took a step forward, then stopped well beyond touching distance. May I tell you something that has nothing to do with Vardon, Fellbrook, tomorrow, or what anyone else thinks? Her pulse quickened. Yes. He drew breath as though the next words required more courage than any public declaration he had ever made. I love you. There was no title in the sentence, no argument, no promise of protection. Oliver simply stood before her, stripped of every advantage except honesty. I love your stubbornness, though I expect it will shorten my life. I love that you opened your door before you knew whether I mattered. I love that you refused to let my rank turn kindness into debt. I love that you tell me when I am wrong, even when I have dressed the mistake as something noble." His mouth moved faintly, especially then. Alice felt tears threaten and refused to let them turn the moment fragile. "You sound very certain. I am terrified." The answer was immediate. Certainty and fear appear to coexist surprisingly well. "What frightens you? That tomorrow may hurt you. That loving me may make some parts of your life harder. That I cannot promise society will become wiser simply because I wish it." His voice lowered. "And that after everything you may decide you do not want this." Alice walked toward him. He did not move to meet her. "If I decide that, will you accept it?" "Yes." Pain entered his eyes, but he held the answer. "I would not call acceptance easy, but yes. And you will not offer me Fellbrook? No, or another house, not unless you ask, or announce an engagement in front of anyone who happens to insult me tomorrow." A flush of shame crossed his face. "Never." Good. She was close enough now to see the tension in his hands, held carefully at his sides. The Duke of Norchester looked less powerful in that moment than the wet stranger who had stood at her door. He also looked more himself. Alice lifted her hand and touched his face. Oliver went utterly still. Her fingertips rested lightly against his cheek, a deliberate choice that belonged to no scandal, no witness, and no necessity. His eyes closed for one brief second beneath the tenderness of it. When he opened them again, he did not presume upon the gesture. "Alice," he said softly, "may I kiss you?" Her heart beat so hard she was certain Mrs. Beale could hear it from the passage. "Yes." Oliver waited another fraction of a second, enough for the answer to remain entirely hers. Then he bent toward her. Alice closed the remaining distance herself. Their kiss was gentle at first, almost solemn in its restraint. No urgency spoiled it. His hand rose only after she leaned toward him, settling lightly at her upper arm, warm through the sleeve of her gown. Alice kept her hand against his face and kissed him back. The world did not disappear. She remained aware of the fire, the clock, Mrs. Beale beyond the doorway, and the public confrontation waiting on the other side of sunrise. That was what made the moment real. It did not require the world to vanish. It simply created something within it that belonged to them. When they drew apart, Oliver did not chase another kiss. His forehead nearly touched hers before he caught himself and gave her space. Alice smiled through the emotion she no longer wished to hide. "I love you too." His breath stopped. "Alice, do not look so astonished. I am trying not to disgrace myself. You are doing poorly." A laugh escaped him, unsteady and real. Alice lowered her hand but did not step away. "Tomorrow I still speak for myself." Oliver's expression became serious at once. "Tomorrow you speak first. And you? Tomorrow I stand where you ask me to stand." She nodded. That promise mattered now in a different way. He was no longer proving he could protect her. He was proving that love had not made him forget her freedom. When Oliver finally left Fellbrook, they were not engaged. No promise of marriage had been requested or given. Alice returned to the drawing room alone and stood for a moment beside the locked writing desk, where the original renewal memorandum remained in her writing case. Tomorrow, she would carry that paper to church. Tonight, for the first time since the storm, she possessed something no one could rewrite by omission. Oliver loved her. She loved him. And neither truth required the permission of Vardon Hall. Sunday morning broke cold and bright, with a thin frost whitening the hedges between Fellbrook and the parish church. Alice carried the original renewal memorandum inside her reticule folded along the same crease it had borne since Lord Vardon returned it, with his condition written beneath the original terms. Mrs. Beale sat beside her in the carriage, unusually silent. Neither woman spoke of Oliver. They did not need to. His promise had been clear. He would be there. He would wait. By the time they reached the churchyard, several carriages already stood along the lane. Families who might normally have arrived gradually seemed determined to be punctual that morning. Alice recognized faces that had recently turned from her in the village. Mrs. Harbury was among them. She looked toward Alice, then quickly toward the church door. Alice felt the old sting and kept walking. Inside, Oliver sat several pews away, near Lord Vardon and Lady Miriam. He did not cross the aisle. He did not create a spectacle from seeing her. When their eyes met, he inclined his head once. Alice returned the gesture. That was enough. The service seemed both shorter and longer than usual. Alice heard the prayers, stood when required, and answered with everyone else. Yet beneath every familiar word lay the knowledge that the true trial would begin only after worship ended. When the congregation finally moved outside, the pale winter sun had climbed above the church roof. People lingered instead of dispersing. Lord Vardon made certain of that. He stood near the churchyard gate, with Miriam beside him, and the rector a few steps away. Oliver remained at the edge of the gathering, exactly where Alice had asked him to stand. Lord Vardon cleared his throat. Conversation thinned. "There is an unfortunate matter I should address," he began. "As several here have heard speculation regarding Fellbrook House, I think it better that uncertainty not continue." Alice felt Mrs. Beale move closer beside her. Vardon continued in the calm tone of a landlord discussing drainage. "The present tenancy will not be renewed after Lady Day. Recent circumstances have made it necessary for me to consider what best preserves propriety upon the estate." A murmur passed through the group. Miriam lowered her eyes with practiced sadness. Alice stepped forward. Oliver did not move. "My lord," she said. Vardon looked toward her. "Miss Aveling, when you speak of recent circumstances, do you mean the night a stranded gentleman came to Fellbrook after his carriage broke down?" The direct question disturbed him. "That incident is part of the matter. Then let us be precise about it." Alice could feel every face turn toward her. Her heartbeat was hard but steady. "The gentleman who came to my door introduced himself as Mr. Oliver Chalfont. I did not know he was the Duke of Norchester." Miriam gave a small, skeptical breath. Alice continued before she could interrupt. "Mrs. Beale was present in Fellbrook throughout the night. His Grace slept downstairs in the parlour. I went upstairs. I made no claim upon him then or afterward. I asked for no money, no property, no favour, and no promise of marriage." "That is exactly so," Mrs. Beale said. Her voice carried surprisingly well. "I was there from the moment His Grace entered until he left the next morning. Miss Aveling was never alone in the house with him." Several people shifted. Mrs. Harbury looked directly at Alice now. Miriam's expression tightened. "No one is accusing Mrs. Beale of dishonesty," she said. "But the later calls are another matter." His Grace returned repeatedly. Surely even Miss Aveling understood what such attention would suggest. Alice looked at her. "His Grace's calls were his decisions, and welcomed by you, yes." The simple answer caused a stir. Miriam seemed almost pleased. "Then you admit it?" "I admit that I received a gentleman who called properly at my house. I do not admit that doing so makes the original act of shelter improper." Lord Vardon intervened. "No one wishes to conduct an argument in the churchyard." "Then perhaps we should not have begun one here." His face hardened. Alice reached into her reticule and withdrew the renewal memorandum. She held it carefully by the edges. You have said Fellbrook cannot be renewed because propriety requires it. Vardon's eyes fixed on the paper. He knew it instantly. Miss Aveling, this is hardly the place for private estate correspondence. You chose the place when you chose to explain my tenancy publicly. She unfolded the same original sheet. This is the memorandum I sent to your estate office asking that Fellbrook be renewed. It was returned to me with a condition in your own hand and your initials beneath it. The murmuring stopped. Alice did not dramatize the words. She did not need to. You wrote that renewal might proceed if I gave written assurance that no improper expectation had arisen from His Grace's accidental hospitality at Fellbrook, and that no future private correspondence or conduct would encourage misunderstanding regarding that connection. Vardon's face had gone very still. Miriam looked at her father. Alice lowered the memorandum slightly. If my conduct made me unfit to remain at Fellbrook, my lord, why did it become fit again the moment I agreed never to receive His Grace? Silence followed. It was not the eager silence of gossip. It was the uneasy silence of people, realizing they had been encouraged to believe the easier version of a complicated truth. Vardon recovered first. The condition was intended to protect all concerned. It protected your preferred conclusion. You are interpreting ordinary caution as coercion. You told me that if I refused to sign, you would explain publicly why renewal was impossible. Someone near the gate whispered. Vardon heard it. Alice folded the memorandum again. I refuse to sign. Miriam stepped forward. Because you expected His Grace to continue courting you. Oliver finally moved. Not ahead of Alice. Beside her, but with enough distance that everyone could see he had waited until she had finished. Lady Miriam. His voice was quiet. The effect was immediate. Miss Aveling did not know my title until the morning after I stayed at Fellbrook. My coachman addressed me as Your Grace in her doorway. That was when she learned who I was. Miriam opened her mouth. Oliver continued. Every later call I made was my choice. Miss Aveling never asked me for money, influence, property, marriage, or any advantage attached to my rank. His eyes moved briefly toward Alice, then back to the gathering. At the hunt breakfast, I made a public statement that I would stop calling upon her. I believed withdrawing would protect her from attention. I was wrong. The admission passed through the crowd with more force than a defense of his pride would have done. I made a decision about her life without asking what she wanted. That was my mistake, not hers. Lord Vardon's expression had become strained. Norchester, surely there is no need to enlarge this. There is every need to correct what has already been enlarged. Oliver's tone remained controlled. Miss Aveling's reputation should never depend upon whether a duke chooses to court her. Miriam went pale. Oliver looked at her directly, and since my name has been used to suggest otherwise, let me be equally clear. There has never been an understanding between Lady Miriam and me. There will be none. That ended more than one rumor at once. Miriam's composure broke at the edges. She looked toward her father, but Vardon had his own retreat to manage. Very well, he said. If my remarks have created an impression beyond what I intended, I withdraw it. No one moved. He had expected that to be enough. It was not. Mrs. Fenley spoke from near the rector. Will you renew Fellbrook, my lord? Vardon's jaw tightened. Yes. Without condition. Alice looked at him. For months, those words would have been security. A week earlier, they might even have felt like victory. Now she understood the price of accepting them. No, Vardon stared. I beg your pardon? I will not renew Fellbrook. Mrs. Beale's eyes widened, though she already knew Alice had considered leaving. Alice continued. I will remain until the present lease ends at Lady Day. Then I shall go. You need not do that, Vardon said. I know. Alice folded the memorandum once more. I will not stay, because you have finally decided I am respectable. The sentence struck harder than anger. Mrs. Harbury lowered her head. Another woman looked openly ashamed. Lord Vardon said nothing. He could not order dignity back into the shape he preferred. Before the gathering dispersed, he was compelled to agree that a correction would be sent to the households where the story had been repeated. Miriam, cornered by the facts she had deliberately thinned, admitted that Mrs. Beale had indeed been present, and that she had omitted the detail when speaking of the night at Fellbrook. Within days, she would withdraw from several winter engagements rather than face the questions her own insinuations had created. No triumph sounded in Alice's chest, only release. People began moving toward their carriages. Mrs. Harbury approached as if she meant to speak, but Alice was not ready to make forgiveness another public performance. She gave the older woman a courteous nod and turned away. Oliver stood a few feet from her. He did not reach for her. Alice looked at him and saw that he was still keeping his promise even now, when everyone knew enough to expect him to claim some visible reward. So she crossed the space herself and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers carefully. Nothing in the gesture belonged to rescue. You waited, she said. You asked me to. Even when you hated it, a faint smile touched his mouth, especially then. Alice looked once toward the church, then toward the lane leading back to Fellbrook. The memorandum remained in her other hand. It was still hers. So was the choice that came next. Oliver glanced toward the road. May I walk you home? Alice tightened her fingers around his. Yes, 5 weeks after the morning, outside the parish church. Fellbrook House still belonged to Alice for a little while longer, but it no longer felt like a place she was waiting to lose. Lord Vardon's unconditional offer of renewal had arrived, in writing, 2 days after his public retraction. Alice had answered with equal courtesy that she would remain under the existing lease until Lady Day, and would not renew it. The original memorandum, with its incriminating conditions still in Lord Vardon's hand, rested among her personal papers in the writing case. She had neither destroyed it nor displayed it again. It had served its purpose. Lord Vardon circulated the promised correction to the neighbouring households, and Lady Miriam withdrew from several winter gatherings, rather than endure the questions produced by her own omissions. Mrs. Harbury eventually called at Fellbrook and apologized without excuses. Alice accepted the apology without pretending the hurt had never happened. More important than any of those changes was one that occurred quietly, 3 or 4 afternoons each week, when Oliver came to Fellbrook as a man courting a woman rather than a duke repairing a scandal. He arrived during proper hours. He walked with Alice when Mrs. Beale or another respectable companion accompanied them. He spoke of Stonecross Park without presenting it as an answer to Alice's uncertainty. When she asked about its tenants, he answered. When she asked about his mother's old rooms, he told her. When she said she would not become responsible for 50 dinner guests merely because someone had once decided duchesses enjoyed arranging them, he laughed and promised to reduce the number to 49. Most important, when Alice disagreed with him, Oliver no longer mistook disagreement for danger. He stayed. One afternoon, in the final week before Christmas, He arrived while pale winter sunlight stretched across the Fellbrook drawing room. The same room had held him soaked and anonymous in October. Now his boots were dry, his coat immaculate, and there was no part of his identity Alice did not know. Mrs. Beale received him, stayed long enough to establish perfect propriety, then withdrew to the adjoining room with the door open while pretending to sort household accounts. Alice noticed at once that Oliver was more serious than usual. "You have the expression of a man about to reorganize Parliament." "I promise I have attempted nothing so reckless." "Then sit down." He did not. Instead, he looked around the small drawing room. His gaze rested briefly on the hearth, then on the settle where the faded green travel rug lay folded. "I wanted to ask you something here." Alice's heartbeat altered. She knew before he continued, yet knowing did not make the moment feel inevitable. That mattered to her. Nothing about this was inevitable. "Here?" she asked. "Here?" Oliver came closer, but not so close that she had to step back. "I have thought about grand rooms at Stonecross, and gardens, and every other place a man with too much property might choose, because he imagines magnificence improves a question." Alice's mouth curved. "Does it?" "No. It makes the question harder to hear." He took one breath. "This is the room where you met me without my title. It seems only fair that I ask you here as the same man." Alice felt emotion rise so swiftly that she had to steady herself before speaking. "Oliver, I am not asking because Vardon insulted you. I am not asking because you may leave Fellbrook. I am not asking because society now knows I love you. And I am not asking because I think marriage is a reward for what you endured." His voice was calm, but she could see the strain beneath it. "I am asking because I love the life I have when you are in it, and because I want to build a life in which neither of us has to disappear when things become difficult." He held her gaze. "Alice, will you choose a life with me?" No one waited behind him for an answer. No guests watched. No scandal required resolution. Even Mrs. Beale, somewhere beyond the open door, had developed a sudden and extraordinary interest in ledgers. Alice crossed the small distance between them. "Yes." Oliver closed his eyes for the briefest instant. When he opened them, she was smiling. That was alarmingly concise. "Would you prefer a speech?" "I had prepared myself for one." "Then you have suffered unnecessarily." His laugh broke with relief. Alice took his hand. "Yes, Oliver, I will marry you." His fingers closed around hers. "I love you. I love you too." He raised her hand, then paused before touching it to his lips. The hesitation was so familiar now that Alice smiled and offered it more fully. Only then did he kiss her knuckles. There were practical matters afterward, because love, Alice discovered, did not abolish solicitors. Oliver's marriage settlement protected her modest annuity for her separate use. He did not question the provision when Alice insisted upon understanding every clause. The banns were called on 3 successive Sundays in her parish church. Each time Alice heard her own name spoken beside Oliver's, she felt no sense of being absorbed into his title. She felt chosen and choosing. Fellbrook remained under her existing lease until Lady Day as agreed, though Alice would no longer live there after the wedding. Mrs. Beale would oversee the household's gradual removal and remain with Alice until everything was properly settled. On an early January morning, frost silvered the churchyard where Lord Vardon had once tried to diminish her. There was no grand crowd now, only the necessary witnesses, a few genuine friends, Mrs. Beale, with suspicious brightness in her eyes, and Oliver waiting near the altar without looking remotely ducal until the moment he had to answer in a voice that carried through the little church. Alice became the Duchess of Norchester there, but the title did not feel like vindication. Her name had already been restored before she married him. That was why she could accept his rank without needing it to prove her worth. After the wedding breakfast, the carriage stood ready for Stone Cross Park. Alice returned upstairs at Fellbrook one last time to collect a small parcel she had packed herself. When she came down, Mrs. Beale saw the faded green wool travel rug over her arm and said nothing. Her smile was enough. Oliver was already inside the carriage when Alice joined him. As the horses started forward, she unfolded the rug and spread it across both their knees. Oliver looked down. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his hand moved over the faded wool with almost reverent recognition. I wondered whether you would bring it. It belongs to me. I remember. An improvement. He smiled. The carriage rolled beyond Fellbrook's gate and turned toward the road that would eventually carry them the 15 or 20 miles to Stone Cross Park. Oliver looked again at the rug. The first time you gave me room beneath this, I had almost nothing I was willing to name except myself. Alice turned toward him. You had a dukedom. I was trying very hard not to mention it. Poorly. As it turned out, he laughed. Then his expression softened. You opened your door to the part of me that had no title to offer you. Alice slipped her hand beneath the rug and found his. Their fingers joined in the warmth beneath the old wool. Then there is room beside me for the same man. Oliver's eyes held hers. This time, Alice did not wait for him to ask. She leaned toward him and kissed him softly. He answered with the same tenderness. One hand still joined with hers beneath the rug, and when they drew apart, his forehead rested lightly against hers for a moment before he smiled. Your Grace, he murmured. Alice raised an eyebrow. Do not become unbearable merely because we are married. I shall make no promises I cannot keep. The carriage passed the turning toward Vardon Hall. Once, that road had represented judgment, dependence, and the approval Alice had been expected to earn. She did not look toward it, neither did Oliver. Ahead, the winter road opened toward Stonecross, toward unfamiliar rooms and a life that would require compromise, patience, laughter, argument, and the courage to remain. Beneath the faded green rug, their hands stayed joined. This time, neither of them let go.